While Part 2 initially has a strong start when Asa is the protagonist, everything about Part 2 went down the drain around the Chainsaw Man churchyard when Denji becomes the protagonist again, and Asa gets sidelined. The writing, the pacing, the character, the art, the direction, the world building, and the tone have seen a noticeable decline. What's been said has already been done, so I'm better off moving on to the main points. Though I will say, rather than finding the pacing to be slow, I found it to be more loose and uneven. Part 1 and early Part 2 have fun memes and fan art. But after the Year Devil memes, which is ironically peak, fan content for Part 2 has decreased significantly. It's also the moment where I realized that perhaps Fujimoto has been glazed by the fans way too much. Part 2 fans patch it up with theories like crazy because they think Part 2 is much deeper than it actually is. And they tend to act aggressively whenever someone criticizes it, which is difficult not to complain, given how divisive Part 2 is. Interacting with it just isn't enjoyable as before and has since become a chore. The alley scene brought up a controversial subject, only to never properly address it. With Denji somehow viewed as a good thing, yes, Denji has a history of abuse, but not to the point of getting violated. Which is especially disappointing given that Part 1 has handled it with far more grace. Undoubtedly, the biggest problem with Part 2 is it just lacks emotional weight. When Aki dies, you can feel every weight of it. Killing off Naruto is one of the worst writing decisions I have ever seen. I'll be damned if someone manages to top it. Regardless of what one thinks of Naruto, not only her being treated as a disposable plot device feels wrong in every way, but aside from turning Denji black again, her death didn't have a more drastic impact on Denji than it should have. And Part 2 is very adamant about the idea of bringing Naruto back at all. You know, it reminds me of a certain character, but I can't quite recall. Odd. After that, most of Denji's characterizations gets occupied by his gooning. While not entirely out of character, it gets irritating fast. Fans can say he's coping realistically. But that interpretation falls flat as his horniness somehow gets used as a source for comedy. And I'm annoyed with it being repeated by the fans a lot. The worst part is, he never once put his perversion aside, whereas Part 1 Denji would have done so for more important matters. I really don't like how the narrative constantly guilt-trips Denji, and fans believe it is entirely his fault. It really infuriated me. Naruto died because of Denji's selfish choice of transforming into Chainsaw Man. Except that was his best choice to salvage the whole mess over concerning his pets. If you're in his position, what would you do? Aside from the aforementioned example, Denji never gets to choose afterwards. I'll get back to it later. Still, being too negative won't be fair, so I will talk about the positives from the later half. The Fire Devil is done surprisingly well. Yeah, that's it. Part 2 tends to give major setups to interesting ideas, only to sorely underdeliver it, and that's somehow your fault for expecting them to be more important. Fake Chainsaw Man happened to be the worst example of it. But it is the rule rather than the exception. I used to like Yoru for her dynamic with Asa, but her heel turn is ultimately the wrong move, because she comes off more as a brat that isn't remotely threatening, and heavily relies on ass pulls after another just to get there. It's why the final arc is considered to be the worst, because Yoru just can't carry it. The fight just keeps dragging on with no weight to it after Death got erased, and gets treated like a huge joke. She also discarded care for Asa and Denji prior to it, But then those conveniently came back despite not being hinted at. Everything about her feels unearned. It has gotten to the point where even fans hate Yoru, which is saying something. And just as we expected a boring fight against Devils, it gives us the biggest middle finger by revealing that they have lost against random Devils despite nothing hinting that they are even above their league because of subversion. Posha then somehow decided that Denji is happier before the contract and ate himself. Despite its constant team of choices, Denji still doesn't get to choose. There's a reason why this kind of conclusion is typically used for one-shots, because it's disastrous for a long-running story. Even among fans, this is a straw that broke the camel's back because that moment betrays everything about Chainsaw Man, and the implication that Denji will actually be worse off without Pocha. Even with my non-existent expectations, this is atrocious. Others are still hoping that the ending of Part 3 will fully redeem it, but by that point, it's best to swallow pills and admit that Part 2 is flawed like most fans did. It isn't healthy to pretend a bad series is good without acknowledging its glaring issues. A good way to describe Part 2 is it punishes anyone for expecting a more standard experience, but it's just so over the place that no one wins. As unfortunate as that sounds, an author will eventually miss. It's too bad that it just so happened to be a sequel to a highly anticipated series that goes out of its way to tarnish Chainsaw Man. The only best course is to pretend it never happened. After Part 2, I'll be staying away from any of Fujimoto's further works, because that experience has been awful.